Controversy in Washington as U.S. President Donald Trump bypasses lawmakers in an attempt to provide economic relief. That as the country tops 5 million cases of COVID-19. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. They are literally trillions apart. So when talks broke down between the White House and Democratic lawmakers, President Trump made good on his threat to take unilateral executive action. There remains a debate over whether he has the constitutional authority, but for the moment, with Americans in need of economic relief, the question is whether or not negotiators will return to the table and find common ground. Well, there is much to talk about. Let's get straight to our panel. Amy Holmes joins us from New York. She's a writer for HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher and a political columnist for the Swiss weekly Die Weltwoche. Ameshia Cross is here in Washington. She's a Democratic strategist and commentator. Steve Chaggaris is a longtime political journalist and analyst. And also with us is writer and commentator Jadan Horyn. He covers the intersection of politics and culture as a contributor to Metropolitan Magazine. Thank you to all of you for joining us. And Jadan, let me start with you. You know, as I said, the United States has surpassed 5 million cases of COVID-19. That's the highest in the world. And of course, there's a very robust debate going on right now about the number of people who've been rendered unemployed by this pandemic and how they can be helped by the government. Well, Congress has had a stalemate. President Trump has decided to take things into his own hands. He bypassed Congress and signed an executive action deferring payroll taxes and replacing the $600 unemployment benefit with $400. Question is, Jadan, is that legal? Can he do that?
The president has the ability to redirect federal funding. And, you know, in 2014, President Obama redirected federal funding from FEMA to assist with the migrants from Central America. So we know that the money is intended to be redirected from FEMA. This is a national disaster, and as such, it fully falls within the statutory authority. It is the adjustment of the amount of money relates to the amount of money that they are appropriating in this case, or readjusting. But certainly Congress needed to act. Congress did not act. The president acted. We may not like it, but I think the central paradox of this is going to be is who is going to sue to take away extended unemployment benefits from the Americans who desperately need them?
And that becomes a bit of a political issue, doesn't it?
Certainly. And, you know, since the advent of this, we have seen this politicized because, unfortunately, COVID occurred during an election year. And because it occurred during an election year, both the president and Republicans and Democrats in Congress, and now Joe Biden, are seeking to take moral high ground when, frankly, this shouldn't be about politics. This should be about ensuring that Americans have what they need in order to get through what is a government-created crisis. I mean, the shutdowns have effectively, you know, purged millions of jobs. And if we do not give and extend these benefits, then people will not be able to pay their bills. So I think these executive orders, while undesirable, are the natural conclusion to impassing Congress.
Ameshia Cross, what do you make of what the president is doing? Because, you know, it's normally the United States Congress that holds the purse strings. The White House, you know, has been talking about this while these negotiations have been taking place. And President Trump says the Democrats are asking for too much. Here's part of what he had to say. Let's listen to this.
In the current negotiations, we have repeatedly stated our willingness to immediately sign legislation providing expanded unemployment benefits, protecting Americans from eviction, and providing additional relief payments to families. Democrats have refused these offers. They want to negotiate. What they really want is bailout money for states that are run by Democrat governors and mayors, and that have been run very badly for many, many years and many decades, in fact.
So, Ameshia, what do you make of the president's objections there and his claim that this is a bailout for Democratic states?
Trump is politicizing a disaster, an economic disaster, one that was created by and large by his failed response to coronavirus. What we know is that states, Republican states as well as Democratic states, have asked for relief from President Trump. So it's always very interesting to me when I hear him only throw or save his amount of shade for democratically led areas. It's frustrating because at the end of the day, what President Trump is doing is issuing basically an authoritarianism type of regime where he is trying to vest powers that do not belong at the seat of the president into his own hands and away from Congress. There's a reason why the Constitution vested powers of the purse strings in Congress. And yes, sometimes there's going to be debates and negotiations, and sometimes they're going to be fractious. And I think that with this being an election year, that makes it even more serious. However, that does not mean that the president can take it upon himself and utilize an executive order to manage this. I think that this is a president who's shown time and time again that he does not know how to negotiate. So for him to be the president who claims he's the negotiator in chief, this is just not working. He cannot cut deals.
Right. Ameshia, what do you make of Jadan's point that what the president is doing is something that has been done in the past by other presidents? He is redirecting federal money that's already been voted on.
He's definitely redirecting federal money, but when we're talking about over $400 billion from FEMA, an organization, a federal agency that was already cash-strapped when it comes to how they were going to be able to manage upwards of 30 tropical storms, hurricanes that are going to occur within this year alone. We know that that is a problem. We know that those storms are going to be stronger than they've been previously, and that this could leave states in a much worse place when they're handling a pandemic, and now they would also be handling the fallout of natural disasters.
Okay. Amy, of course, the Democrats are not happy with what President Trump is planning on doing or has done. Here is the House Speaker, the Democrat House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi speaking. Let's listen.
Whether they're legal or not takes time to figure out. I associate myself remarks with Senator Sass, who says they're unconstitutional slop. He's saying states have the money. No, they don't. They have expenses from the coronavirus. They have lost revenue. Because of that, they are firing healthcare workers, first responders, teachers, and the rest. Sanitation, transportation workers, because they don't have the money. Second of all, everything is left out. Our assistance to the schools, feeding the hungry, helping people who are going to be evicted.
So a couple of things, Amy, that Nancy Pelosi said there. One, she said she's hearing people tell her that it's unconstitutional. She also says that it doesn't, the amount of money that President Trump is talking about doesn't address things like money for schools or money for food or money to avoid evictions.
Well, Anand, I think viewers could be forgiven for being confused by who are the Democrats and who are the Republicans in this big Capitol Hill dogpile that we're discussing. If you remember back in 2012, President Obama, he extended the payroll tax holiday, and he was lauded as a great hero, a champion of the working class. Now Democrats are deciding that the payroll tax holiday is irresponsible, and Donald Trump is overreaching his constitutional authority. Again, back in 2012, President Obama, he very delightfully bragged that he had a pen and a phone, and he was going to do an end run around a recalcitrant Congress to get legislation done if need be, by executive order. And conversely, Republicans back then said presidents can't do that. They can't use a pen and a phone to bypass the legislative process. But now they're cheering on Donald Trump because he's brought Democrats to the negotiating table. Interestingly enough, there seems to be, at least at this moment, again, it's Monday, who knows what will happen for the rest of the week, but there does seem to be some common ground. President Trump today in his press conference at the White House, he said that his executive orders would sunset after the election. Nancy Pelosi over the weekend, she said that their demands on the Democratic side also would sunset after the election. So they seem to be edging up closer and closer to a deal. But Anand, as a former Senate staffer for a former Senate Majority Leader, the dog that didn't bark that I'm interested in is Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, because he's the person who actually has the power to legislate in the Senate and try to bring this together for a bill that can pass.
Steve, what do you make of this? The presidential election, of course, is less than 2.5 months away, and President Biden, at least the candidate, the Democrat opponent, Joe Biden, has called President Trump's executive actions, quote, a series of half-baked ideas. Do you agree with Amy that what the president has done here, could actually have the effect of pushing the two sides to start renegotiating?
Well, it could. I think this is a political maneuver for a couple of reasons. First of all, the Republicans have not really been able to agree upon what they want to offer Democrats in the debate over a new bill. And so you have some conservatives saying, we don't want to spend another $3 trillion or $2 trillion. And you have some Republicans who are running in tough re-election races who are saying, look, let's just get a deal done, get this out of the way so we can go home and tell people we're doing our jobs. And so I think what the president's doing here is really trying to bait the Democrats in two ways. One, either try to bait them into suing over these executive actions and try to make the Democrats look bad for suing against these, which, to be honest with you, there's not a lot of teeth to this stuff. There's not a lot of stuff in these 4 executive actions that we're going to see have real impact over the next several months. There'll be a little bit of an impact, but not a huge amount of impact. So if it's not baiting Democrats to sue, it's baiting Democrats to come back to the table and lower their demands in a deal, in a potential deal. And so I think that's what we're seeing here.
So, Steve, it also seems a little bit counterintuitive politically when you listen to this debate, because normally in an election year, one would imagine politicians saying, we're going to vote for this money, we're going to give you free money here, hey, vote for us.
Sure, except that there are many people who have, especially on the Republican side, who have said, we have spent trillions and trillions of dollars, we're adding to the debt, and they don't want to continue that, even though you would think from a political standpoint, especially amid a crisis, that that's not a top of mind of most Americans at this point. And so it's an interesting resistance from conservatives at this point, but that's where they are, and that's one of the reasons why this is stuck.
Jadan, turning to the election itself, President Trump's approval ratings, they are slowly increasing despite the spread of the virus, the spread of the pandemic, and that's despite overwhelming numbers of Americans who say that they are not happy with his handling of the pandemic. In fact, 68% say they disapprove of the way he's handled that. But he is down in key battleground states. We're looking at some figures today. States like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, he's down in those states. He's down in those states 6 points in each state. Does he have time, 2.5 months, to turn this around?
I certainly think so. If we look at 2016, we saw that the polls in general, kind of overstated the lead of Hillary Clinton, especially in the battleground states. And, once again, I would say that the polls are off. Not that they're overwhelmingly wrong, but that they are off. I think they underestimate the support that the president does have in these states. As a Pennsylvania native, one thing that I can say is that his straight talk and kind of blue-collar appeal is very real. Joe Biden used to have that and kind of lost that, and I think that kind of gives the president an edge. But we still have 2 months, and there's a lot that can happen. Certainly, the vice presidential pick of Biden. Certainly, what happens with the coronavirus if the government can manage to increase testing, if we can manage to decrease case positives, then that would certainly benefit the president. And I think we should all be rooting for that. So, to answer your question, I think without a doubt there is a potential and pathway forward. Yeah. The real question is the campaign really articulating a message that is resonating with people? And I would argue I haven't really heard that. I haven't heard a cohesive message other than the president is out there working.
Right. Ameshia, Jadan just mentioned the Democrat vice presidential pick. There was a poll done by CBS News, and it said that Biden's choice for vice president will have an impact on the race. He's expected to announce that decision later this week. And the top contenders now appear to be the former National Security Advisor Susan Rice, Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, and Senator Kamala Harris from California. Who do you think would really help boost Biden's chances in this race?
Senator Kamala Harris, hands down. I think that she has that energy, she has that name recognition, she has an embedded group of support, and she's someone who is a very strong balance to the moderate side of what Joe Biden brings to the table. And I think that she's also someone who is not afraid to get into a fight and not afraid to be attacked and attack back. I definitely think that she would be the top choice.
When you say she is a counterbalance to the moderate side of Joe Biden, is she seen as something of a progressive among Democrats?
Yes. Definitely. Kamala Harris is seen as a progressive, and we can see that through several of the initiatives she's passed, as well as a lot of the stances that she's taken over the past 4 or 5 years. She's someone who has been out in front on a lot of the social justice movements, and I definitely think that she's someone who many people in that community would actually support.
She's got very bad media, very bad press, though, about her time as Attorney General both in San Francisco and in California.
And to be honest, I think that that would happen to any attorney general in this country, because few people really understand the role of the attorney general, nor did they fully understand that we haven't always been in this criminal justice reformist ideologue that we happen to be in 2020. A few years ago, 3 years ago, we weren't even where we are right now. So I think that history will look upon her very differently.
Right. Amy, what do you think of what's going on the Democrat side, the vice presidential pick? Who would help Joe Biden?
Well, Anand, historically, vice presidential picks actually don't move voters when it comes to election day. They're voting for the top of the ticket. But what a VP pick can do is reflect the top of the ticket's values to the party, that VP pick can be unifying, can bring together warring factions. And I think Kamala Harris does that very well, as was just outlined before. And of course, that person has to be able to argue the case of the ticket and do no harm. Be somebody who, unlike Joe Biden at the top of the ticket, doesn't get into gaffes, doesn't say things like, you ain't black if you're not voting for me, or African Americans are less diverse than Latino Americans. Kamala Harris could certainly help him hone that message, particularly to the African American community, with all of those stumbles and bumbles. But I got to tell you, Anand, Republicans, they are already licking their chops at the prospect of going after Kamala Harris because of her positions on gun control. When she was in the primary, in the Democratic primary, she said she would sign executive orders if she were in the White House to to step up gun control legislation, or step up gun control in the United States. And as we know, that is a top issue for people who believe in the Second Amendment, and they do vote on that.
Steve, as Amy says, vice presidential picks don't normally move voters in either direction. But this time, we are hearing from analysts and from commentators that this pick is extremely important because of Joe Biden's age and the fact that he will probably not run for a second term. So is it more important this time that we take a closer look at who he picks?
Perhaps. I mean, I think long term, but there's no real indication from polling that people are sitting on the edge of their seat waiting to see who Joe Biden's going to pick and make a decision on whether they're going to support Biden or not based on who that pick is. I think Amy makes a very good point that historically it's just not a huge deal unless, really, frankly, the running mate brings negative attention to the ticket. And that's what I think he's going to try to avoid doing. I mean, look, he's set himself up in a pretty good situation right now. That's really beyond his control, and it's beyond Donald Trump's control. The circumstances of this country, I mean, the president is facing not really just an opponent in Joe Biden, but his biggest opponents are COVID and dealing with that, and how Americans have overwhelmingly said that they don't approve of his handling of that. And frankly, Americans' outlook on the future of the country. And right now, Americans are very discouraged. There was a poll by Gallup last week that showed 13% of Americans are dissatisfied with how the direction of the country. And that's the kind of thing that really people are going to be voting on in November. And if Donald Trump can't change those numbers, it almost doesn't matter what Biden does in terms of his running mate or not.
Amy, what do you make of that?
I would agree with all of that, and I interviewed James Carville for the Swiss weekly magazine Die Weltwoche, and he said to me he doesn't care who Biden picks, up to and including Sarah Palin, that this is a referendum on Donald Trump and Donald Trump alone. But I would add that we still haven't gotten into the debates and Joe Biden's performance on the debate stage, and that could very well shape public opinion of whether or not he has the stamina to go the distance.
Jadan, I want to get into another issue that's dominating this election cycle, and that is the whole issue of mail-in voting. President Trump doesn't like the idea. He says that Democrats are trying to steal the election with their support for mail-in voting. And those who support mail-in voting say that there's little evidence to show that there has been fraud. But of course, now we have the new circumstance of the pandemic. Who does mail-in voting support?
Mail-in voting supports the voters, but I think the president has an important concern with mail-in voting and how it's executed, and that's the real thing. Whether there's fraud or not, that's an entirely different question. But we know here in New York City that in the Democratic primary in June, that it took 6 weeks for them to declare a winner, that over 80,000 ballots were invalidated by the Board of Elections. The very Democrats who say that we should trust mail-in voting are the very Democrats who do not have an answer in their own primary. 6 weeks of uncertainty would be deleterious to our democracy. It would be incredibly dangerous if we do not know the results of a nationwide election due to 50 different sovereign jurisdictions implementing multiple different ways of doing mail-in voting without uniformity and without a standard, and then all of the legal challenges that would sweep across the nation. It would make the 2000 election look like nothing. And frankly, that is a real concern. That is a concern that I have. I think the president shares that concern, but he's focused more on the fraud side. And I think the administration should be much more concerned with the actual execution that would be done.
Ameshia, what do you make of the president's opposition to mail-in voting? And of course, the concerns that Jadan has just raised there, that we could have a situation after November 3rd when we will not have a result. In fact, I think the Federal Election Commission has already said that it's highly unlikely there will be a result on the evening of November 3rd, and that this could go on and it could be, it could end up in court, in many courts for that matter.
The president likes to signal fear, and he likes to create stories that aren't based in fact. Over 70% of his own administration mail-in votes every election, including the president himself. Mail-in voting has been known to be safe. Mail-in voting, my biggest concern would be President Trump's postal general. The USPS is having money taken away from it on a regular basis. We know that mail goes slow. We know that it goes even slower because we have a president that is dead set on disenfranchising as many voters as possible. He does that even when mail-in voting does not exist. The Republican Party has done a really good job of picking and choosing who they want to vote. Donald Trump has a problem with mail-in voting when it is Democratic voters, diverse voters voting. He is on that same token, while he's waving that dog whistle on a daily basis about mail-in voting, also sending out campaign emails to his supporters, encouraging them to use the very same system that he is railing against on Twitter and in every interview he can possibly do. So I think that this president is quite frankly lying.
What are your thoughts on that, Amy?
Well, we see that the other side, the Democratic side, also aided and abetted by the Lincoln Project, that they've just launched what they call the Transition Integrity Project, where they're gaming out just what Jadan was discussing, which is this endless process after November 3rd of recounts and getting all those mail-in ballots and not having a decisive winner, and what that could do to tear our country apart when we have a tradition of knowing who's going to be the President of the United States, save 2000, at least in our recent memory, knowing who that person is going to be the very next day. To see all, possible lawsuits in 50 states and recounts and 6 weeks out, I think that would be a disaster for democracy and very demoralizing for our fellow Americans.
Steve, could we see a sort of nightmare scenario where the outcome of the election could be caught up in court challenges for weeks after the election?
Well, there are very serious questions about how this election is going to be administered state by state. We're going to see more mail-in ballots, whether it's everybody being mailed a ballot to send in or people just electing to do it themselves. And the states, as we've seen through the primaries, are not necessarily ready for the number of ballots that are going to be coming in. And I think that's the biggest issue here. Trump is really playing politics with all this. I think he's trying to set up an excuse if he doesn't win in November by pointing toward fraud or mail-in ballots. But the real issue here is the administration of elections in all 50 states. Are they going to be able to mail the ballots out in time? Are those ballots going to be understood and filled out in a way by voters and then returned on time? And how are those votes going to be counted in a way that is not going to raise questions among voters as to the integrity of the election? And I think this isn't just about the presidency. This is about Senate races and House races and every other race that's on the ballot. If you have a loser in a race that is going to point to questions about how an election was administered, that is a major problem. And if it's a widespread issue in many states, this could very well be a mess after Election Day. And I think states need to make sure they have all their ducks in a row as they get up to Election Day, or else they could be hearing from losing candidates from both parties raising questions about how these elections were administered.
Ameshia, politics aside, these are important issues, aren't they? The manner in which the election will be conducted, because states have pretty stringent requirements on when a mail-in ballot is sent in. If it comes in, I think, the day after the election, it cannot be counted. I mean, all those things, will that lead to perhaps a big question mark being put over the outcome of the election?
I'm not necessarily as worried about that as I am worried about, again, the Postmaster General and what's happening with USPS overall. In addition to that, those who live in rural areas, those who are going to have to pay for postage, which is essentially a poll tax, if you have to pay for postage to mail off your ballot.
Right.
I'm concerned with how states are managing elections in general, even without mail-in ballots. We know that there are states that have voting machines that don't work. There are states that have poll workers who have called out consistently because the average age of a poll worker in America is 65, with coronavirus running rampant and that being the age group that's most affected. You're not going to see those folks working the polls.
Right.
I am concerned on both sides, whether you're doing it the traditional way or whether you're voting mail-in, whether or not states not only have the capacity, but whether they're supported by the state parties, but also by the federal government. And right now, we're seeing a presidency that is dead set on not doing so and is absolutely fine with a large swath of Americans not being able to exercise their right to vote at all.
Yeah, Ameshia, in the little time we have left, I just want to bring up another issue that made the news this week, and that is Joe Biden made yet another controversial remark regarding race, remarks which could alienate young black voters. He was pressed by a reporter on whether he had taken a cognitive test. He responded by saying, you're taking cocaine or not? Are you a junkie? I mean, looking at those kinds of responses, are those comments going to hurt him?
In the
I don't know
run,
if
I
the
don't think.
comment.
Sorry, I'll get to you, Amy. Go ahead,
sorry.
Ameshia. Yeah.
In the long run, I don't think so. I think that what we see with Joe Biden is someone who sometimes, speaks above his skis, makes unsavory comments, but they aren't. I don't blame it on his heart. Sometimes he makes comments that are outside of what they should be, but I don't think that it's going to affect him long term. The Democratic Party and Democrats across the country are engaged in a serious voter turnout regimen, and I think that including policies that actually matter to young people, about student loans, about their first employment, about housing, those are things that people care about. And as long as that is the messaging and those are the policies he's pushing, I don't think he's going to have to worry about a gaffe here or there.
Okay, Amy, go ahead.
I don't think it's the gaffes that Biden needs to be worried about when it comes to the young African-American vote. I think it's what Charlemagne the God said to him, that it's not voter suppression he's worried about, it's voter depression. And can Joe Biden activate and energize those young voters to get to the polls?
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.